do you approach change in your organization? When I ask leaders that question, some aren't really sure. Some talk about their change management methodology or their project management office. And that's not surprising because most of the emphasis on change management is often given to having a methodology. But it's your approach to change that can dictate how you use your change management methodology and enables you to leverage a methodology's full value. In this video, I want to share with you 4 approaches to enabling organizational change. I'll share why one approach, despite being the most used, is the least effective, and how the least used approach delivers higher levels of sustainable change. If you're new here, my name is Dr. Dawn-Marie Turner. I'm a change leadership coach and creator of the Readiness Mindset and president of Turner Change Management. I help CEOs and executives experiencing multiple simultaneous changes use a readiness mindset and science-based strategies to prevent resistance and grow a healthier, stronger organization. Do you use a change management methodology? If you do, that's great. The key to leveraging the full value of your methodology is to ensure that you can combine an approach that includes the intangible human dynamics of change with the concrete activities and steps outlined in your methodology. Before we talk about the 4 common approaches to organizational change, it's helpful to explore what I mean by your approach and how it differs from a methodology. A change management methodology is a structured set of activities for initiating, planning, and implementing organizational change. I've developed one called the DEAM methodology. Like other methodologies, project management, business process reengineering, it provides a consistent framework for guiding decisions and the activities that are needed to enable and facilitate change in your organization. But your approach to change is different. It's broader and goes deeper than a methodology. It reflects your values and beliefs about change. For example, do you believe that people are resistant to change? Or are you working with a readiness mindset that believes people, when they feel prepared and capable, will move towards something new and different? Your approach drives what you focus on throughout the change process. It influences the time you allocate, how you perceive and involve people that are affected and will need to do that heavy lifting. Ultimately, it's your approach that predicts your outcome. In my practice, I see 4 typical approaches used to enable change, and I've labeled them based on their most prominent characteristic. The first and probably the most common approach to organizational change is what I call the project-centric approach. This approach draws heavily from project management. Leaders using this approach focus on creating a project team and having that project team define the tasks, the activities, milestones, and deliverables for enabling change. The assumption with this approach is that if all of those tasks and activities, all those deliverables are met, change will occur. And although this approach is better than nothing, and it tends to be the most popular approach, research has shown that it's not the most effective approach. And that's because it has a couple of key disadvantages to the approach that is the most effective. The first is because involvement and responsibility for key decisions and planning is limited to a select group of people, usually the project team or the change management team, then ownership for the adoption of those activities and behaviors is discouraged. It's important to remember that the smaller the number of change recipients involved, the less likely those new activities and behaviors will be adopted. When you focus on a few select people to lead change, you inhibit that change from occurring because the change recipients are absolved from owning its success or failure. The second disadvantage of this approach is that it assumes change can be managed in a linear manner. The concrete nature of most of the tasks and deliverables in a typical project plan often overlook those intangible but necessary elements needed for people to make the transition. And we don't move through change in a series of steps. We move through change more like a dance. So it's more emergent and iterative than just completing tasks and deliverables. The third disadvantage of this approach is that the time allocated to achieve the intended outcome is usually defined by the time the project team needs to complete its tasks and deliverables. And yet the time needed for people to fully adopt and reach new steady state often extends well beyond when those deliverables and tasks are completed. And that usually isn't accounted for in the project timeline. And when we fail to achieve the adoption of those new activities, what I call that new steady state, then the change is unstable. And the risk is that people will revert to their old ways of working, those old activities and behaviors. Just as an aside, when I talk about new steady state, I don't mean that your organization is stagnant or that there's no other changes going on. It means that what you're looking for is that those new activities and behaviors, those activities and behaviors needed to achieve that desired outcome are fully embedded and operationalized as the normal activities for going forward. They're at the point of, this is the way we do things around here. One of the things that I often see when I'm working with organizations with a history of change that doesn't stick is that they haven't allowed for that adoption time, that they've assumed once the tangible elements of the change have been implemented, that the change is done. And as a result, many of the employees learn, I can just wait this out and things will go back to the way they were. A second approach to organizational change has the elements of the project-centric approach, but I call it the training-centric approach. And the key difference between the training-centric approach and the project-centric approach is that leaders who use this approach put more emphasis on training. They assume that training will lead to change. I know I'm working with an organization that has an approach that is training-centric. When we're having conversations about the kind of support and what will be needed for adoption, managing the uncertainty and some of the stress, and everything is put into the training, and the leaders keep referring back to, well, we're going to train them. Well, we'll give them training on this. Then I know that those leaders are really putting so much emphasis and expecting the training to carry the load. And it just simply can't. Although training is necessary, it's just not sufficient to enable change. Check out my video, Why Training Doesn't Lead to Change. I'll put the link in the comment section below. A third approach to organizational change that builds off that project-centric approach is communication-centric. This approach may or may not incorporate project management and training. It often does. Two assumptions appear to drive this approach when I see it in organizations. The first is that leaders assume that knowledge will equal action. If people know what to do, they will do it. If people are trained to use the new techniques, software, they will follow through and do it. And the second belief is that change management is really just good communication. But one study found that a communication or persuasion approach that was favored mostly by middle and top level managers was not the most successful, and it took the longest amount of time to achieve adoption. However, there is one advantage of this approach over the project-centric and the training-centric approach. And that is that change recipients generally receive more information. Although the information can tend to be one way, passive, and focused on what the leader wants people to know, with less room for conversation, they are receiving more information about the change with this approach. A fourth approach to organizational change, and the one that I advocate and work with our clients to adopt, I call the change recipient-centric approach. The change recipient-centric approach builds on all of the strengths of the previous approaches. It allows you to use the discipline of project management when it's needed, to create the conversations that are so important for change, and recognize where and how to build the skills and knowledge people will need to have in order to adopt those new activities. But this approach also recognizes that enabling sustainable change is a participative, emergent process and must actively involve the people affected. This approach emphasizes building readiness and focuses on creating collective commitment. Leaders who use this approach view, plan, and guide the change process from the perspective of the people who are expected to adopt those new activities or behaviors. They are at the center. And one study exploring this type of approach found that it led to 90% of top managers' decisions being fully adopted, and it took the shortest amount of time. This approach has three key advantages over the other approaches. Because people are at the center and they are actively involved throughout the organization in the decisions and planning that is appropriate for them, it encourages ownership and builds that commitment early on. The approach also is grounded in people readiness. You get change faster when you focus on people readiness and not just organizational readiness. The third advantage of this approach is that change is approached from a sense of working with the people affected instead of doing change to them. And as a result, because you're working with them and not to people, you build more change capability within your employees. What approach are you using when it comes to change in your organization? Write it in the comment section below. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, remember to click that subscribe button and have a wonderful day. Bye for now.